Hi, I'm Dorothy, and I'm 74 years old. Last month, on my birthday, I set the table in my own dining room for two people, my late husband's chair pushed in on one side, my son's favorite plate on the other, roast chicken and mashed potatoes the way he liked them since he was 8 years old. And at 6:30 my phone rang, and my son David told me in a hurried voice with traffic noise behind him that he wouldn't be coming because he had already agreed to have dinner with his wife and her mother instead. I sat there for a long time before I picked up a fork. I want to tell you exactly how I got to that table, alone, because it wasn't really about one missed dinner. It was about a house with my name on the deed, a piece of paper they wanted me to sign, and a family that had quietly decided I was easier to manage than to listen to. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house when you realize you have become, to the people who are supposed to love you most, a problem to be handled rather than a person to be heard. I didn't understand that quiet until I was living inside it every day. It doesn't announce itself with a slammed door or a raised voice. It comes in soft phrases, in appointments made without asking you, in a folder of papers left on your kitchen counter with a sticky note that says, "Just sign where I marked it, Mom. It's easier this way." Have you ever noticed that shift, the moment your own family starts talking about you instead of to you? Have you ever sat in a room while people decided what was best for you as if you weren't sitting right there? If any part of what I'm about to tell you sounds familiar, I would love to know where you're listening from tonight and what part of your own life brought you to a story like mine. If you want to hear more voices like this one, all it costs you is a tap on that subscribe button below this video. It's completely free, and it's the only thing that keeps me able to keep telling these stories to people who need to hear that they aren't alone. So, if this reaches you, please subscribe before we go any further, and then let's start from the beginning. My name is Dorothy Reeves, and I live in a modest 3-bedroom house in the Roundtree neighborhood of Springfield, Missouri. The same house my husband Frank and I bought in 1983 with a loan we paid off, month after month, for 30 years. Frank passed 6 years ago, quietly in his sleep after 41 years of marriage, and since then this house has been the only thing in my life that has stayed exactly where I left it. It isn't a mansion. It's a plain brick house with a covered porch and a maple tree in the front yard that Frank planted the year our son David was born. But it's worth close to $210,000 now, paid off free and clear, and it is, without question, the largest thing either of us ever built together. I still remember exactly how it felt the day we signed the papers on this place, a young couple with a baby on the way and barely enough saved for the down payment, standing in the empty living room listening to our own footsteps echo off bare walls we hadn't yet hung a single picture on. Frank carried me over that threshold even though we weren't newlyweds anymore, just to make me laugh, and I remember thinking that whatever else happened in our lives, we finally had 4 walls nobody could take away from us, as long as we kept paying what we owed. That feeling never left me, even after Frank was gone, even in the quietest years. This house was the one place I never had to ask anyone's permission to exist in. The kitchen still has the yellow tile Frank and I picked out together in 1991, chipped now in one corner, where David dropped a cast-iron pan as a teenager, and I have never once considered replacing it, because every small imperfection in this house is a sentence in a story only I remember the whole of anymore. I make my coffee every morning at the same counter where I once helped David with long division, where I iced birthday cakes for 46 consecutive years, where Frank and I sat the night before his heart surgery holding hands and not saying much of anything at all because there wasn't much left that needed saying after 4 decades together. David is 46 now, and I raised him mostly on my own during the years Frank worked double shifts at the plant to keep us afloat. I packed his lunches, drove him to practice, sat up nights when he was sick, and later, when he married Jennifer, I welcomed her the way I would have welcomed a daughter, because that is what I believed a mother does. I never once thought I would spend my 70s wondering whether my own son still saw me as his mother or as a situation that needed to be resolved before it became inconvenient. I still keep myself busy. In case you're picturing a woman who sits idle waiting for the phone to ring, I play bridge on Tuesday afternoons with 3 women I've known since our children were in grade school together. I sing in the choir at Grace Methodist on Sundays, and I volunteer twice a month at the food pantry 2 blocks from the church, sorting canned goods with hands that, whatever anyone in my family might quietly suggest, have not lost a single bit of their capability. My friends there see me clearly, the way people who aren't waiting to inherit anything from you tend to see you clearly, and it was often their eyes, not my family's, that first noticed something was wearing on me during those 2 years. There was a particular year when David was 11 and Frank had been laid off for 4 months, when I took in ironing and mending from 3 families across town just so David could keep playing baseball with the right cleats and the right glove. And I never told him about it until he was nearly 30 because I didn't want him carrying weight that belonged to me. I tell you that not to ask for credit, but so you understand the shape of what I believed motherhood was, a thing you do quietly, without a ledger, without ever expecting the favor returned in exact measure. I built my whole understanding of family on that belief, and for most of my life it served me well. When David married Jennifer 8 years ago, I hosted the engagement dinner in this very dining room, made my grandmother's pot roast recipe, and cried real tears when Jennifer hugged me afterward and said she'd always wanted a mother like me. I believed her completely. I still want to believe some part of her meant it even now, even after everything, because it is a hard thing to accept that a kindness you received once might not have been entirely free of calculation. The shift didn't happen all at once. It happened the way water wears down stone. So slowly you don't notice the shape has changed until one day you look at your own reflection and don't recognize the outline anymore. It started, I think, about 2 years ago with small comments about my memory, about my driving, about whether I was managing my bills correctly, comments that always arrived wrapped in concern, the way a splinter arrives wrapped in a handshake. And it grew, quietly, until decisions about my own life were being made in rooms I wasn't invited into. By the time Jennifer's mother, Barbara Colby, started coming to every family gathering, sitting at the head of conversations about my own house as if she had a seat reserved there from the beginning, I had already learned to stay quiet and watch. I am not a woman who raises her voice. I am a woman who pays attention. And what I paid attention to over those 2 years told me something my son was too distracted or too unwilling to admit to himself. Barbara Colby was, by every outward measure, a pleasant woman, the kind who brought a homemade pie to every gathering and complimented your tablecloth before she'd even taken off her coat, and for the first year I knew her, I liked her well enough, the way you like any polite acquaintance who doesn't ask too much of you. It was only slowly that I began to notice how often her compliments about my house came paired with a small comment about how much upkeep a place like this must require for a woman on her own, how often her questions about my finances arrived disguised as concern for my comfort. She had a way of talking about my life as though it were a slightly worrying project she had generously taken on, and it took me longer than I'd like to admit to recognize that pattern for what it was. It started with a phrase, repeated so often, it began to sound like a lullaby meant to put me to sleep rather than comfort me. "It's for your own good, Mom." I heard it the first time when David suggested I let Jennifer manage my online banking because I had once paid a bill twice by accident. I heard it again when they suggested I stop driving to church on my own and let someone pick me up instead, even though I had never had an accident in 56 years behind the wheel. Each time the phrase arrived gentle and smiling, and each time it took something small away from me and never gave it back. There was the matter of Thanksgiving, too, the year before last, when I found out only 3 days beforehand that it had been moved from my house, where I had hosted every single Thanksgiving for 38 years, to Jennifer's parents' house, because Barbara had already started cooking, and it seemed easier not to disrupt her plans. Nobody asked me whether I minded giving up a tradition that had outlasted 3 different ovens and 1 entire kitchen renovation. They informed me the way you'd inform a guest of a change in seating, and I remember standing in my own kitchen that year, staring at a turkey I had already ordered from the butcher, wondering exactly when I had stopped being the one whose plans mattered most in my own family's calendar. I ended up donating that turkey to the food pantry where I volunteer, and I spent that particular Thanksgiving with 3 widowed friends from my bridge group instead, which turned out, in its own quiet way, to be one of the more honest holidays I'd had in years. Even if it wasn't the one I had planned for the family I still believed at the time, considered my house a home rather than a resource. Barbara was the one who introduced the word that would come to define the next several months of my life. It was at a Sunday dinner, over pot roast, when she set down her fork and said, in the calm tone of someone discussing the weather, that at my age it really was time I considered getting my affairs in order properly, with a general power of attorney that would let David handle things if anything ever happened to me. She said it the way you'd suggest someone buy a raincoat before a storm, practical, reasonable, impossible to argue with at the dinner table, without looking difficult. I told them I already had a will, drawn up years ago with Frank, and that I managed my own affairs just fine, thank you. Jennifer smiled the smile she always used when she thought I hadn't understood something and said, Dorothy, a power of attorney is different. It's not about a will. It's about someone being able to step in and pay your bills, handle the house, talk to the bank, if you're not thinking as clearly as you used to. I noticed she didn't ask whether I was thinking clearly. She stated it softly as an established fact I simply hadn't caught up to yet. I said I would think about it, mostly to end the conversation, and I went home that night and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, feeling something I hadn't felt since Frank's funeral, a specific hollow loneliness that comes not from being alone in a room, but from being surrounded by people who have already decided who you are before you've said a word. I thought about all the years I had shown up for David, all the nights I hadn't slept because he had a fever, all the sacrifices that never once needed to be discussed at a dinner table because that is simply what a mother does without asking for credit. Over the following months, the requests didn't stop. They multiplied. There was always a new reason the paperwork couldn't wait. David mentioned it was for the house insurance. Jennifer mentioned it was in case of a medical emergency. Barbara, who by then was practically furniture in my living room, mentioned it every single time she visited, usually followed by a story about a friend of hers whose mother had fallen and no one could access her accounts to pay for care. A story I began to suspect she kept in her purse like a business card, ready to produce whenever the conversation needed steering. I want to tell you about one particular Thursday because it stayed with me longer than the others. I had gone to the bank myself to move some money between my own savings and checking, a simple errand I had done 100 times, and when I got home, there was a voicemail from Jennifer asking, with a lightness that didn't quite reach her voice, whether everything was all right. Because David had mentioned I'd been at the bank and she just wanted to make sure I hadn't gotten confused about which account was which. I hadn't gotten confused about anything. I had simply gone to the bank, the way any adult manages her own money, and yet somehow that ordinary errand had become a data point in a story they were building about me without my permission. Another time, at a barbecue in David's backyard, I overheard Barbara telling a neighbor, in the breezy tone of someone sharing helpful gossip, that poor Dorothy really shouldn't be in that big house alone anymore. It's a load for someone her age to keep up with. Loud enough that I was clearly meant to hear it, or perhaps not caring whether I did. I was at that moment standing 12 feet away holding a tray of deviled eggs I had made from scratch that morning, my hands steady, my mind perfectly clear, listening to a woman half convince a stranger that I was already halfway gone. What none of them seemed to notice, or perhaps what none of them cared to notice, was that I had begun writing things down. Not out of suspicion at first, simply out of the old habit of a woman who balanced a household budget for 4 decades and trusts numbers more than feelings. I wrote down dates, I wrote down exact phrases, I wrote down who said what and when in a small spiral notebook I kept in the drawer of my nightstand next to Frank's reading glasses that I still hadn't been able to give away. The clearest sign came on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring, when I stopped by David and Jennifer's house to drop off a casserole and heard, through the screen door before anyone knew I had arrived, Barbara's voice saying that, once Dorothy signs, we won't have to keep having this conversation every time she gets stubborn about the house. I stood on that porch for a full minute, casserole dish warming my hands through the oven mitts, and I did not walk in and confront anyone. I turned around, drove home, and sat in my own driveway for 20 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to turn off the engine. I sat there replaying the sentence in my mind over and over. Once Dorothy signs, we won't have to keep having this conversation every time she gets stubborn about the house. Stubborn? That was the word she'd chosen. Not careful, not sensible, not a woman protecting the one thing she owns outright at 74 years old, but stubborn, the way you describe a mule that won't move or a stain that won't lift. I sat with that word for a long time in my driveway, engine still running, casserole going cold on the passenger seat. And I understood that somewhere in that house, my son had been listening to that word applied to his own mother and had said nothing to correct it. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did what I have always done when my mind won't settle. I got up and cleaned something that didn't need cleaning, wiping down kitchen cabinets that were already spotless at 11 at night, because my hands needed a task simple enough to keep them from shaking while my mind worked through what I had just heard. Somewhere around midnight I stopped, dish towel still in my hand, and said out loud to my empty kitchen, "I raised that boy better than this." Not in anger exactly, but in a kind of grief for the version of David I still believed was in there somewhere, buried under Barbara's careful instructions. If you have ever stood outside a door and heard your own family discuss you, like a problem on a checklist, you already know there is no anger sharp enough to match that particular kind of quiet devastation. I didn't cry that day. I made myself a cup of tea instead, and I promised myself something I hadn't said out loud in years, that whatever they were planning for my house, they were going to have to go through me first, and I was not nearly as confused or as tired as they had decided I was. If this part of the story feels close to something in your own life, I'd ask you to do one small thing for me right now. Just tap subscribe, it costs nothing, and it's how these stories reach the next person who needs to hear that noticing what's happening to you is not the same thing as losing your mind. After that afternoon on the porch, something in me changed quietly, the way a thermostat resets without anyone touching the dial. I stopped mentioning the power of attorney at all, and to my surprise, that silence made them louder, not angrier, just louder. More frequent, as if my quiet was something they read as progress. David started calling more often, always circling back, gently, to whether I had had a chance to think about the paperwork. Jennifer began bringing printed forms to family dinners, leaving them folded on the side table by the door as if they might simply disappear into my purse on their own. My birthday was coming up at the end of the month, and for the first time in years, I found myself hoping, almost childishly, that it might be a day when none of that mattered. A day where I could just be somebody's mother again instead of somebody's project. I planned the dinner 2 weeks in advance the way I used to plan holidays when Frank was alive, with lists on the back of old envelopes and a small calendar of tasks pinned to the corkboard in the kitchen, because I have found that anticipation, done properly, is half the pleasure of any occasion. I bought the good tablecloth, the one Frank and I received as a wedding gift that I only ever used for real occasions. I called David myself on a Sunday and asked him plainly whether he and Jennifer could come for dinner on my birthday, just the three of us, nothing fancy, his favorite roast chicken. He said yes without a second of hesitation, and for 2 weeks I let myself believe that yes meant what it used to mean. 3 days before my birthday, Barbara mentioned, almost in passing over the phone to Jennifer, while I happened to be visiting, that her cousin's daughter's engagement dinner had been moved to the same night. A big family event on her side, one she made sound both spontaneous and somehow already fully planned in every detail, down to the restaurant and the guest list. I remember standing in Jennifer's kitchen holding a glass of water, watching Jennifer's face carefully as she listened to her mother, watching the exact moment Jennifer's expression shifted from mild interest to calculation. I noticed something else that afternoon too, something small that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. Jennifer glanced at me, quickly, almost involuntarily, the way you glance at someone to gauge a reaction before you've said anything that should require gauging, and then she looked back at her phone and said, into it, "Mom, we'll figure it out." "Don't worry," in a voice that was already deciding the matter before David had even been consulted. I stood there with my glass of water sweating in my hand and told myself it was nothing, that daughters and mothers make plans together all the time, that I was reading too much into the ordinary noise of a family that wasn't mine by blood. But I've lived 74 years learning to read the difference between an ordinary family noise and the particular hum of a decision already made, dressed up afterward as a coincidence. And that Tuesday afternoon in Jennifer's kitchen had the second sound, not the first. The sound of two women who already knew exactly what night they intended to be somewhere else, discussing it as though the universe had simply arranged itself that way on its own. I said nothing that day because I told myself I was imagining things, that a woman my age can start seeing conspiracies in casseroles if she isn't careful. I went home and finished planning my birthday dinner as if nothing had shifted. I set the table 2 days early because it made me feel closer to the day. I polished the good silverware. I bought David's favorite dessert from the bakery on Commercial Street. He used to beg me for as a boy, a coconut cream pie, and I put it in the refrigerator with a little note taped to the box that said, "For my boy," which now embarrasses me to admit. But that is exactly the kind of woman I still was 3 days before my birthday. On the day itself, I spent the morning cooking, the way I used to when Frank was alive and the house was full. I roasted the chicken slowly, the way David liked it, skin crisp, and I made the mashed potatoes with real butter, instead of the margarine I usually allow myself now. I set 2 places at the table, his and mine, and I put on the blue dress Frank always said brought out my eyes, the one I usually save for church on Easter. And I put on the small gold earrings Frank gave me for our 30th anniversary, and I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a moment longer than usual, thinking that 74 wasn't such a terrible age to arrive at, not if you still had a son who wanted to sit across from you and eat roast chicken on a Tuesday evening. I lit the 2 candles in the middle of the table, the ones I'd been saving in the china cabinet, and I turned the porch light on so David would be able to find his way up the walk in the dark. And at 6:30, exactly when I was setting the pie down on the counter to cool, my phone rang, and it was David, and behind his voice I could hear restaurant noise, glasses, laughter, someone calling out an order. He told me, in the tone people use when they've already made a decision and are only informing you of it, that Jennifer's family was having an important dinner tonight for her cousin's engagement, and that Barbara had specifically asked them to come, and that he hoped I would understand, that we could celebrate properly this weekend instead. I asked him as calmly as I could manage whether he remembered what night this was. He said, "Of course I know it's your birthday, Mom. That's why I'm calling, so you're not waiting on us," as if the courtesy of the phone call was meant to replace the courtesy of showing up. I told him it was fine. I have told my son it was fine more times in my life than I can count, and every single time, some part of that sentence has been a lie I told to protect him from the truth that it was not fine at all. I hung up the phone, and I stood in my kitchen in my blue dress next to a roasted chicken and a coconut cream pie with a note on it that said, "For my boy," and I did the only thing that felt honest in that moment. I sat down alone at a table set for 2, and I ate my own birthday dinner across from an empty chair and an untouched plate, while somewhere across town my son laughed at a table full of people who were not, in the end, his mother. I blew out the 2 candles myself, a little after 9 when the wax had already pulled low and I finally admitted to myself that no one was coming to see them lit. I wrapped the roast chicken in foil and put it in the refrigerator, cut myself a small slice of the coconut cream pie, the one with the note that said, "For my boy," and ate it standing at the counter, because sitting back down at that table felt like more than I could manage a second time that night. I washed the good silverware by hand, dried each piece slowly, and put it away in the felt-lined box Frank and I received as a wedding present, and I remember thinking quite clearly that I had spent an entire day preparing a celebration for a son who had not once, in scheduling his evening, considered what it would look like from where I was sitting. I want to be honest with you about something. I did not cry that night either, not right away. I sat at that table for almost 2 hours after the food went cold, and what I felt was not exactly sadness, it was clarity, the kind that arrives late in life and all at once, like a light switched on in a room you'd been walking through in the dark for years, bumping into the same furniture without ever once turning it on. I looked at that empty chair and I understood, finally and completely, that I was not simply being neglected. I was being prepared, slowly, patiently for something, and that dinner had just shown me exactly how little room I actually occupied in my own son's decisions. That is the night I stopped being a woman who waited to be included, and became a woman who intended to find out on her own terms precisely what was being planned around her kitchen table. If any part of you has ever felt that exact shift, the moment politeness stops being kindness and starts being self-protection, I hope you'll subscribe to hear more of these stories. It's free, and honestly, it helps me more than you know to keep telling them, especially the ones that end the way I intend for mine to end. The next morning, I called an old friend from my church choir, Linda Pierce, who had spent 30 years as an estate planning attorney downtown before easing into a smaller practice out of a converted house on Walnut Street. Linda and I had sung alto together every Sunday for over a decade, and she was one of the only people left in my life who had known me since before I became, in my own family's eyes, a situation to be managed. I told her everything, the porch, the phone calls, Barbara's cousin's engagement dinner, the birthday, and she listened without once interrupting, the way only a woman who has heard hundreds of similar stories knows how to listen. Linda asked me one simple question. She asked whether anyone in my family had ever shown me the actual document they wanted me to sign, word for word, rather than just describing what it would supposedly do. I realized, sitting in her small office with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands for the second time in 2 days, that no one ever had. They had described a power of attorney to me the way you'd describe a helpful appliance, something that made life easier, something for emergencies, but not one of them had ever handed me the actual pages and asked me to read them. Linda told me something that morning that I have carried with me ever since. She said, "Dorothy, in 30 years of doing this work, I have never once seen a document meant to protect someone that its own beneficiary was afraid to let that person read." She said it gently, without any drama in her voice, the way you'd state a fact about the weather, but it landed in me like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that touched every conversation I'd had with David and Jennifer over the past 2 years. I drove home that afternoon, replaying every single time one of them had described that document to me in generalities, never specifics, always reassurance, never text. I asked Jennifer the following week, in a tone as light as I could manage, whether I could simply see a copy of the form they wanted me to sign, just to look it over on my own time before deciding. She hesitated for exactly 1 second too long before saying, "Of course," and 2 days later an envelope appeared in my mailbox with the paperwork inside. Unsigned, unexplained, 6 pages of dense legal language that I brought straight to Linda's office without opening it myself first, because I wanted someone who actually understood the words to read it with me. What Linda found, reading through those pages line by line at her kitchen table with her glasses pushed low on her nose, was a general durable power of attorney, broader than anything either of us expected, granting whoever I named as my agent immediate and ongoing authority, not just over my bank accounts and my medical decisions, but full power to sell, transfer, mortgage, or otherwise dispose of any real property in my name, including my house, without requiring any further signature or consent from me once the document was executed. Linda set down the pages and looked at me over her glasses and said quietly, "Dorothy, if you sign this, they would not need to ask you again before selling your house. They would only need to ask a buyer." She walked me through it slowly, comparing it, page by page, to the simple will Frank and I had drawn up together decades earlier, the one that only ever took effect after death, and only ever distributed what already belonged to us. Nothing more. This new document was nothing like that. It would take effect the moment I signed it, while I was still very much alive, and, as Linda put it plainly, still entirely capable of deciding for yourself, and it would hand my agent authority not just over emergencies, but over the single largest asset I had built in 50 years of marriage, effective immediately, with no requirement that anyone check back with me at all before acting on it. "Dorothy, if you sign this, they would not need to ask you again before selling your house. They would only need to ask a buyer." Linda repeated the sentence a second time, slower, so it would sit with me properly, and then she asked me directly whether anyone had explained to me that a more limited, more specific power of attorney existed, one that could authorize exactly the bill-paying and medical coordination they claimed to want without ever touching the deed to my house at all. Nobody had ever mentioned that option to me. Not once, in 2 years of gentle pressure, had a single person in my family suggested the version of this document that would have actually matched the reason they claimed to want it. I sat with that sentence for a long moment. Not shock exactly, because some part of me had already suspected it, the way you suspect a storm is coming from the particular color of the sky even before the first drop falls. What I felt instead was a strange, settled kind of grief. The grief of confirming something you had hoped, right up until the last second, was only your imagination. I asked Linda to help me understand my options quietly, without telling anyone in my family that I now knew exactly what that document would allow, because I wanted to see with my own eyes how far they intended to take this before I said a single word. Those 2 weeks were some of the strangest of my life, because I moved through ordinary family gatherings, Sunday dinners, a phone call from David about a plumbing problem at his house, a visit from Jennifer with a magazine she thought I'd like, all while carrying the exact knowledge of what they intended for my home and saying nothing about it, smiling at the appropriate moments, refilling coffee cups, behaving in every visible way like a woman who still believed the story she'd been told. It is a strange kind of loneliness, holding a truth that changes everything while everyone around you continues speaking as though nothing has changed at all. I remember one Sunday dinner in particular, during that quiet period when Barbara mentioned casually over dessert that she'd heard property values in Roundtree were holding up nicely, a comment so ordinary on its surface that anyone else at that table would have let it pass without a second thought. I only smiled and said I hadn't been keeping track and passed her the cream for her coffee, while inside I was cataloguing, the way I had learned to catalogue everything by then, exactly which of my suspicions that single sentence had just confirmed. Over the following 2 weeks, I did something I had never done in 74 years of trusting the people I loved. I started keeping a folder in the same nightstand drawer as my spiral notebook next to Frank's glasses, of every text message, every printed form, every date someone mentioned the paperwork, and every conversation I could recall accurately enough to write down that same evening while it was still fresh. I am not a suspicious woman by nature, but I have learned that the people who tell you not to worry about the details are usually the same people counting on you never checking them. I also, quietly, took a few practical steps that I told no one about at the time. I called my bank directly and asked them to flag my account so that no changes to authorized users could be made without me appearing in person with photo identification, a service the young man at the branch, no older than my grandson would be if I had one, set up for me in about 15 minutes while treating me with more respect than I had received from my own family in months. I also asked Linda to run a simple check with the county recorder to make absolutely certain no document had already been filed anywhere regarding my property, a possibility that frightened me more than I let myself admit until I had her written confirmation that the title remained entirely, solely in my name. There was one more evening, about 10 days before the meeting at Linda's office, when I sat at my kitchen table with my folder spread open in front of me, reading back through my own notes in that small spiral notebook, and I felt something shift inside me that I want to describe honestly. It wasn't triumph, and it wasn't quite anger either. It was closer to the feeling of finally standing up straight after holding a heavy box for too long, the strange, almost painful relief of setting something down you'd forgotten you were carrying. I closed that folder, made myself a cup of tea, and for the first time in months, I slept the whole night through. 3 weeks after my birthday, David called to say the family wanted to sit down together and finally get the paperwork handled properly, and that Jennifer had already spoken to a notary who could come to the house that Saturday. I told him calmly that I had decided I wanted my own attorney present for anything I signed regarding my house, and that I would prefer we meet at her office instead, where everything could be reviewed properly and notarized on the spot. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that tells you someone is recalculating, and then David said, a little too quickly, that of course that made sense, that it was smart of me to be careful. Linda offered her small conference room on Walnut Street, the one with the tall window and the good coffee, and we set the meeting for the following Saturday morning. I told David it would just be the four of us, him, Jennifer, myself, and Linda, but when Saturday came, Barbara arrived too, uninvited, stepping out of Jennifer's car in a cream-colored coat, explaining brightly that she just wanted to be there for support, as though this had ever been a decision that required her support rather than her absence. I felt my stomach tighten watching her walk up Linda's front path in that cream-colored coat. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular discomfort of watching someone insert herself once again into a room she had no business standing in. I said nothing about it at the door. I had learned, over those 2 weeks of quiet documenting, that the value of what I knew depended entirely on not spending it too early. And so I simply held the door open and offered her coffee, the way my mother raised me to offer coffee to anyone who crossed my threshold, invited or not. We sat around Linda's conference table, David and Jennifer on one side, Barbara beside Jennifer, and me across from all three of them with Linda at the head of the table, the same 6 pages spread out in front of her, now covered in small yellow tabs marking specific paragraphs. I had not told any of them what Linda and I had already discussed. I wanted them to hear it for the first time exactly the way I had heard it, from someone whose only job in that room was to tell the truth about what those words actually meant. Linda began reading slowly and clearly, the way she must have read hundreds of documents to hundreds of families over 30 years. And when she reached the 3rd page, she stopped and read one sentence twice out loud, deliberately. The agent shall have full and immediate authority to sell, convey, mortgage, lease, or otherwise transfer any interest in real property owned by the principal, without further consent, notice, or signature required from the principal. She looked up over her glasses at David and asked plainly whether he understood that this meant that once his mother signed, he would not need to ask her again before selling this house. Only a buyer. David's face went pale in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy caught in a lie he didn't yet know how to defend. He said, quickly, that it was standard language, that it was just there for emergencies, that nobody was planning to sell anything, and Jennifer nodded along beside him a little too fast, saying it was simply how these documents are always written. I watched Barbara's face during all of this, and Barbara's face did not move at all, which told me more than anything either of them said. I sat quietly through all of it, my hands folded in my lap the way I used to fold them in church as a girl, waiting because Linda and I had already agreed, without ever needing to say it aloud twice, that I would let the document speak for itself before I spoke at all. I looked at David's hands on the table, the same hands that used to grip mine crossing busy streets, now gripping a pen he hadn't yet been asked to use, and I felt something complicated, not quite anger, closer to sorrow watching a grown man scramble to defend a sentence he clearly hadn't read carefully himself before agreeing to ask his own mother to sign it. It was at that exact moment, while David was still explaining that nobody had any plans regarding the house, that Barbara's phone, sitting face up on the conference table beside her purse, lit up with an incoming call, and because her hearing aids were paired to it by Bluetooth, the ringtone came out not from the phone's tiny speaker, but from the small conference room speaker built into the table itself, the one Linda used for client calls, loud and clear for everyone to hear. Before Barbara could reach it, a voicemail from an earlier missed call played automatically through that same speaker, a voice I didn't recognize, cheerful and businesslike, saying, "Hi Barbara, it's Renee from Prairie Realty. Just confirming once the paperwork closes, we can list the Roundtree property right away. Comparable homes in that neighborhood have been moving fast. I'll have the listing ready to go the same week." Nobody in that room moved for what felt like a very long time. I watched the color drain from David's face a second time, this time not from being caught in a small lie, but from realizing, in front of his own mother and his own wife's mother, exactly what he had allowed himself to be a part of. Jennifer's hand went to her mouth, and she turned to look at her own mother with an expression I had never once seen on her face before, something between disbelief and a kind of grief for whatever she had believed about her mother up until that exact second. She said quietly, almost to herself, "Mom, you talked to a realtor?" Not as a question because it wasn't one anymore, but as a fact she was hearing out loud for the first time and could not yet fully absorb. Barbara reached for her phone with a steadiness that told me this was not the first business call of its kind she had taken, and said only, weakly, that it was just information, nothing had been decided. A sentence that landed in that room with all the weight of a confession. Linda, to her credit, let the silence sit for a full 10 seconds before she said anything, and I have never in my life been more grateful for another woman's patience. She simply looked at Barbara, then at David, then at Jennifer, and said evenly, I think we should all take a moment before anyone signs anything today, which was, I understood even then, the kindest possible way of saying that the meeting, as originally planned, was already over. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I looked at David and I said quietly that I had spent 2 years being told this document was for emergencies, for bills, for doctors, and that in all that time, not one of them had mentioned a realtor already lining up a listing for a house that still, as of that morning, had my name and only my name on the deed. I told them that I would not be signing anything that day or any day that gave anyone the authority to sell my home without my knowledge, and that the only thing that had actually changed in that room was that now everyone present understood exactly what had almost happened. Linda gathered the pages calmly, the way a professional gathers evidence rather than paperwork, and said that she would be keeping a copy of everything discussed today for my records, and that if I ever wanted to explore a more limited, specific power of attorney, one that protected me rather than exposed me, her door was always open. She did not need to say anything more than that. The document that was supposed to take my house from me had, in the end, exposed exactly who had been planning to take it. In the weeks that followed, I made a few decisions, and I made them plainly without shouting, because I have found in 74 years that clarity does far more damage to a bad plan than anger ever does. I went with Linda to the Greene County Recorder of Deeds and confirmed in writing exactly what I already knew, that the house was mine alone, free and clear, with no liens and no other name attached to the title. I did agree eventually to sign a narrow, specific power of attorney limited strictly to medical decisions, one Linda drafted herself, with David named only as a backup if I were ever truly incapacitated, and with no authority whatsoever over my home or my finances. I read every line of that one myself, out loud at Linda's kitchen table, before I ever picked up the pen, and I signed it in front of a notary Linda trusted personally, not the one Jennifer had originally arranged to come to my house that Saturday. I also sat down with my own accountant, a quiet, careful man named Harold, who has done my taxes since Frank retired, and asked him to walk me through every account I hold, every statement, every automatic payment, just so I could say with complete confidence that I understood my own finances better than anyone standing in my kitchen offering to simplify them for me. It took an afternoon. It should not have taken 2 years of gentle pressure from my own family to convince me that afternoon was worth spending. I also asked Linda to help me update my will properly, something I had been meaning to do since Frank passed and had simply never gotten around to. And in that process I put in writing, clearly and without ambiguity, exactly how I wanted this house handled after I'm gone, who would inherit it and under what conditions it could ever be sold. It felt strange sitting in Linda's office signing my own will while thinking about the very different document I'd nearly signed weeks earlier. One meant to protect my family after my death. The other meant, however it was dressed up, to relieve certain people of the inconvenience of waiting for that day to come naturally. I changed the locks on the house too, not out of any specific fear that someone would let themselves in, but because it felt important, symbolically and practically, to know that every key in existence for my own front door was one I had personally handed out, to people I trusted, for reasons I understood. I gave a spare to David still, because despite everything he is still my son, and this is still in every way that matters, still his childhood home. I did not give one to Jennifer's mother. Barbara stopped coming to family dinners after that Saturday. Nobody asked her not to, not directly, but an invitation that had once been automatic simply stopped being extended, and when I saw her at church a few weeks later, She nodded at me stiffly from across the room and did not approach, which told me she understood in her own way exactly what had shifted. Word travels in a town the size of Springfield, and it wasn't long before a few of the women in my bridge group mentioned delicately that they'd heard from a mutual friend at the Roundtree Neighborhood Association that Barbara had been asking around about property values on my street for months before that meeting. Quietly, the way you ask questions you don't want traced back to you later. Whatever standing she had built for herself in that neighborhood, the standing of a helpful, concerned mother-in-law, thinned considerably once people started comparing notes. I heard secondhand that the listing agent named Renee never did get her call back about the Roundtree property, and I imagine that particular embarrassment cost Barbara more sleep than mine ever did. I even ran into Renee herself once at the grocery store on Glenstone Avenue, and she recognized my name from somewhere and asked brightly and entirely without malice whether I was still thinking about selling, and I told her, just as brightly, that the house wasn't going anywhere as long as I had breath left in me, and left it at that. Because some conversations don't need me to explain the whole story to a stranger holding a cart full of groceries. Jennifer called me about 2 weeks after the meeting, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it, and asked if she could come by on her own, without David, just to talk. I said yes, because I have never believed in closing every door in a family, only in choosing carefully which ones I keep unlocked. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had eaten alone on my birthday, and told me that her mother had been managing her own finances so poorly for years that Barbara had, in Jennifer's words, gotten it into her head that the same thing needed fixing everywhere, whether anyone asked for it or not. It was, I think, as close to an honest explanation as I was ever going to get, and it didn't excuse what had happened, but it helped me understand the shape of it. I told Jennifer, as gently as I could manage, that I understood her mother's fear better than she might expect, because I too know what it is to watch money and security slip through your fingers and want desperately to control something, anything, before it happens again. But I told her too that her mother's fear did not give anyone the right to rewrite my ownership of my own home without my full understanding, and that if she wanted a real relationship with me going forward, it would have to be built on truths spoken plainly, not concerns delivered in soft, managing tones designed to move me toward a signature. David came to see me alone about 10 days after that meeting, sitting at my kitchen table where he used to do his homework as a boy, and he apologized in the plain, awkward way men his age apologize when they've never quite learned the words for it. He said he hadn't fully understood what he was asking of me, that Barbara had made it sound reasonable, that Jennifer had gone along because her mother pushed, and that seeing me across that conference table, realizing what he'd nearly signed away without ever truly reading it himself, had frightened him more than he wanted to admit. He asked me quietly, staring at his own hands on my kitchen table, whether I could ever really forgive him for how close he'd come to going along with it. I told him the truth, that forgiveness wasn't a single door that swings open all at once, that it was more like this house, room by room, and that we could start walking through it together if he was willing to do the slow work of earning back the rooms he'd let go dark. He nodded, and for a moment he looked less like the man who'd sat across from me at Linda's conference table, and more like the boy who used to fall asleep on this same table, doing his math homework, waiting for me to finish the dishes so I could walk him up to bed. I told him something I'd been turning over in my mind since the night of my birthday dinner, sitting alone at that table with the untouched plate across from me. I told him that I loved him completely, that I would always love him completely, but that love was no longer going to mean silence, and it was no longer going to mean signing whatever was placed in front of me simply because it arrived with a gentle voice attached to it. I told him that being 74 does not mean being confused, and that if he ever wanted to help me with anything again, the first step would be asking me, and the second step would be believing my answer. If you've ever had to draw a line like that with someone you love without ever raising your voice, I hope you'll take a moment to subscribe. It costs nothing at all, and it genuinely helps these stories find the people who need to hear that setting a boundary isn't the same thing as breaking a family. It's often the only thing that keeps a family from breaking further. The following spring, on a Sunday afternoon, David came by with his own toolbox and repaired the porch railing that had been loose since Frank passed, without being asked, without mentioning the paperwork, without bringing Jennifer's mother along. We sat on that porch afterward, drinking sweet tea the way Frank and I used to. And it wasn't a full repair of everything that had cracked between us over those 2 years. I'm not naive enough to believe one afternoon undoes that. But it was a beginning, an honest one, built on him finally seeing me clearly instead of managing me carefully. I think about that empty chair across from me on my birthday sometimes, and I no longer feel only the sting of it. I feel a strange kind of gratitude for it, because that untouched plate is what finally made me stop mistaking politeness for peace. Growing older does not make a woman foolish, and it does not make her invisible, no matter how gently people try to convince her otherwise. If anything, it teaches her to read a room the way she once read a recipe, carefully, noticing exactly what has been left out. If you take one thing from my kitchen table tonight, let it be this. It was never the age that made me fragile. It was the people around me who tried to convince me that it had, because a fragile woman signs quietly, and a clear-eyed one asks to read the fine print first. Whatever your own version of that paperwork looks like, whatever quiet form it takes in your life, I hope you read every single line before you ever pick up a pen. I still set 2 places at that dining table sometimes, on ordinary Sundays now, not out of habit, born from hurt, but because I've decided that table belongs to me and I get to choose what it means. Some Sundays, David sits in that second chair, and some Sundays it's Linda, still humming old choir hymns under her breath while we eat. And some Sundays it's just me and my own good company, which I have come to value far more than I ever expected to at this age. Thank you for sitting with me through this whole story, all the way to this table, this porch, this small victory that never once needed to be loud. I know there are people listening tonight who are further along in a story like mine than I was on the day of that phone call, and others just beginning to notice the first small comment, the first meeting they weren't invited to, the first folder of papers left quietly on a counter. Wherever you are in that story, I want you to know that noticing is not paranoia, and asking questions is not confusion. It is simply what a woman does when she still rightly considers herself the author of her own life. If it meant something to you, please subscribe, it's free, and share it with someone who might need to hear tonight that dignity has no age limit and neither does the right to be told the truth. I'll see you in the next story.